This is AgGrad Live,
We have all of the different segments within the cotton.
the show that explores what it's really like to work in the ag industry,
So making sure that we get policy and regulatory issues
straight from the people who live it every day. Hey, AgGrads, I want to start off this live broadcast with an announcement that I always forget. I always remember that we are doing these live on Facebook, and I'm talking to whoever of you can show up live and to our guests, but I always forget to mention that this also gets repurposed into a YouTube channel and into a podcast. So before I forget on this one, the podcast needs your help. If you listen to this program on the podcast, or if you listen to it where, it doesn't matter where you listen to it. If you use podcasting at all, go to the iTunes app or Stitcher or Android, whatever you use. Please subscribe, rate, and review this show. It helps other people find it. Those that can't be here to watch live, like some of you are, do listen on the podcast, and just encourage you all to help others find it. So find AgGrad Live on your favorite podcast player. Subscribe, rate, review, and help spread the word about these cool stories that are going on with people that are getting involved in agriculture and making a difference. And we definitely have one of those people on the show here today in Stephanie Henry. Stephanie, I'm going to bring you on the show right now. Welcome to AgGrad Live.
Hi.
So, Stephanie, for those of you following along here, Stephanie, I think you first found me through the Future of Agriculture podcast. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, found me through Future of Agriculture, and you and I connected online and started talking, and I have just been really, really impressed with Stephanie's ability to just make things happen. She developed an interest in agriculture, and she got involved. And one thing that I have to confess is I have never done a very good job of getting really involved in my local community. And that's something that I want to change and something I want to get better at, and something I think all of the people in the AgGrad community should strive to do as well, is make an impact locally. And so I've been really excited, Stephanie, to bring you on the show and ask you a little bit more about kind of how to do that, or how you've done that, and get to know your journey a little bit. So maybe for starters, before I get too far ahead of myself, just tell everybody that is tuning in, how did you first get really interested in agriculture?
Thanks. Thanks for having me to start with. It's an honor. So how did I get started in agriculture? It started when I was a kid. I always loved feeding people. And I knew I wanted to have a farm to fork restaurant when I was 6 years old, but I focused on the kitchen part of it because I grew up in the Midwest and you're surrounded by farms. And I just kind of assumed there was always going to be enough farmers to provide the sort of things that I wanted to have at my restaurant. And then it took about 20 more years, and I started to realize as I got more and more involved in the community that it needed some help. And the more questions I asked, the more kind of concerned I got, and the more involved I got, realizing that our farmers do need a lot of support. And
All right, sorry about that. I froze up on my end for a little bit, so that's my fault. We have a storm blowing in here, so hopefully that doesn't continue to happen. But so your journey of finding kind of like how farmers needed help in your community, that started with you thinking, oh, I'll have a farm to table restaurant, and the farmers will just supply me everything I need. Is that right?
yeah. And then, that wasn't the case.
So explain, why wasn't that the case? What did you find when you set out on that road?
Well, for starters, like I went out to my friend's farm and there was a lot of corn. I was like, hey, can I have some corn? When I do something, she's kind of laughing at me. She's like, go ahead and pick some. And I went out and I picked it, and it was awful. And I'm like, what is this? And she's like, that's field corn. She's like, that's not sweet corn. And we sat down and we had a conversation about the acreage that her family had and what they were growing on it, and the fact that pretty much nothing that they were growing on their hundreds of acres of farm was actually directly consumable, not something that I would be using in my kitchen. So.
Yeah, and I remember when you first reached out to me, you said, whenever people talk about food deserts, they talk about the middle of a big city, but you can have food deserts surrounded by rural acreage for commodity crops, just because there isn't a built up local food system. That can happen in urban areas. It can happen in rural areas as well. What did you decide ultimately to do once you kind of stumbled upon this issue in your community, which we should mention, everybody, that's Fort Wayne, Indiana, right?
Yep, Fort Wayne, Indiana, the overgrown Mayberry of the Midwest. It's the big town with a small town mentality. So
Oh, wow.
everybody's your neighbor.
You're selling it. But no, it's so I know you got involved somehow kind of locally through either a government organization or grassroots organization. Take us through that part of the journey.
I actually moved to Fort Wayne because I wanted to get involved in some more community initiatives. And where I came from, which was a peripheral community, Fort Wayne was the closest community that had a lot of potential in it. And so when I moved to Fort Wayne, I started being more intentional with my time, volunteering at organizations and then I kind of stumbled into starting a community garden. They had torn down a house in our neighborhood and I was living in an apartment, so I didn't have a lot of land myself. And I was like, this will be a great opportunity to start a garden, but I needed tools. So I went and knocked on a neighbor's door and asked him, and he's like, oh, that sounds like a great idea, but did you know we're a historic neighborhood and we have a neighborhood association and you should bring that to our meeting? A couple weeks later, we had some city people and presented a proposal to our, neighborhood association and started a community garden. And I've learned a lot of lessons since then, both about, how to run a community garden, the materials that you need, how to manage people when you're doing those sorts of things. And it just started me on this path of asking more and more.
And I don't want to just gloss over the fact that what you did right there is something most people don't do. I mean, you saw a problem and then you just started talking to people. You started knocking on doors and just kind of decided before you even knew what process you had to go through to start a community garden. Why do you think more people get stuck at that part? And what have you learned that might help them?
I think my friend calls it analysis. And then we also get hung up on things that we don't know. We're scared to try things that we don't know. And people are like, it's government, there's regulations, I don't know all that. I should just, ignore it. There's somebody who's working on that and I'll just find something to join into. I guess I never kind of childlike quality just going for things. And then I also think that part of it is time and availability. I'm not married. I don't have kids. So that leaves me a lot of flexibility to do things that other people may not, because they have a lot of requirements on their time. And I'll be honest, the process that I took is a time. I spent pretty much all of my free time, wandering around to community offices, down to the planning office and to, neighborhood code and enforcement, and spending a lot of time having what I thought was interesting discussions, but other people probably wouldn't, with our elected officials and with our public servants. And that's honestly, time is not something that a lot of people have.
Well, and the time helps, but also I think analysis paralysis happens to a lot of people. I think they think, oh, if this was a solvable problem, somebody else would already be solving it. So it must not be, it must be too difficult. I must just not know what I don't know. And I think it's just a little bit of like, how am I going to look if this whole thing fails as well? And so I know starting anything new, whether that be kind of a grassroots community type project or a business or anything else, there's always that fear that like, hey, this really may not work. Once you had kind of the community garden and you started engaging with local officials, what encouraged you to keep going? I mean, what encouraged you to kind of follow this path of sort of civic engagement to where you are today?
It may be bad to admit this, but everyone's saying no and that it wasn't going to happen kind of made me feel like that's a challenge that I wanted to take. I'm like, this should totally be a thing. Plus the sense of just empowerment that came with planting that first garden. And I do want to mention that first garden that we planted, we did without any major sponsorship. It was all done with donations from local nurseries, local construction companies, even the local butcher shop donated meat for the cookout for our volunteers for the day of. A church down the road allowed us to use their electricity and help us to stage things. So it was a community garden in every sense of the word, in that we had no funding, no big supporters, no big donations or anything. It was all very little donations gotten, just one-on-one having conversations with different organizations, and then they gave us what they could.
That's great. And so all of that has ultimately led your journey to where you are now, which is a grassroots intern in DC. Why don't you tell everybody what you're doing now and how that experience has been?
Right now, I am sitting in the DC office of the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. Technically, I'm in our communications office because she has a gorgeous office, but I'm working here in DC with NSAC. Working on the Farm Bill, working on food policy. The Farm Bill is the large piece of legislation that gets reauthorized right now every 5 years, more or less, give or take. And it kinds of things, everything from commodities to loan payments, insurance, pretty much you name it, it's in there. And that makes it a very challenging, and especially in times where we have a lot of contention within our parties, it makes for very challenging work.
Yeah, no, I believe it. What has been, would you say, the kind of the biggest either surprises or lessons or kind of takeaways that you have gleaned from your time there so far in DC? I know you probably have a month or so left, but what have been kind of the biggest takeaways so far?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. There's so much. I mean, I knew coming into it, it would definitely be kind of a fire hose of information, but I really underestimated really how much is contained within the Farm Bill. I really didn't have a full understanding of how many things are underneath that and how many different aspects that touches on. Also realizing there's a lot of amazing people who are doing work on this. It is a lot of work. It's thousands and thousands of pages of information. It's a lot of meetings and conversations where people are trying to, compromise and find a solution that will work for everyone. And, what NSAC does is, as a coalition of organizations across the nation, we work with our members and we talk with them and, put their requests, their needs, their issues in front of the people who are making these decisions, so that they understand that this is not just numbers and words on a page. These are people's lives. These are people's farms, businesses, families, and it's really important, the decisions that are made in this. So, yeah, a lot of information.
Now, I know you mentioned you got to actually sit down with your elected official while you're there in DC. What advice would you give to others that maybe have never taken that opportunity? And I guess what takeaways from that experience specifically can you share?
Great question. I've actually sat down with 3 of my my federal delegation at this point, 1 of my senators and 2 of our state representatives. And honestly, I would say, what do you have to lose? The process is fairly easy and open. These are our elected officials. They are technically our public servants. They work for us, and they don't know what we experience on a daily basis. And if we don't take the time to try and share that information with them in a way that makes sense, and clearly spells out what the challenge is or what the need is or what the desire is, you can't expect them to work on those, and they can't know everything. I mean, this is as big a thing as the Farm Bill is. It's one of so many other really big pieces of legislation that they're all trying to juggle. So if you have an issue, if you have something that you're passionate about or something that you're trying to do or something that you're worried about, taking the time to, make an appointment either with your local office, or if you have the opportunity to come here to DC, coming here and making that ask and sharing that information directly with them, it's definitely worth your time. I do recommend absolutely doing some sort of a printout of some kind, with your highlighted points and things like that, because they don't have a lot of time to talk to you. So it's not like you're going to be having an afternoon hanging out and having coffee with them. You know, it's like 15 minutes. Tell me what you need. Tell me what the problem is. Okay, gotta go.
Maybe we can get Stephanie back on a future episode of AgGrad Live, because I think this civic engagement piece is one thing that's been really missing from our content and a lot of the agricultural messages out there, which is you can contact directly your officials, either locally, statewide, or in DC, and you can have an impact on the future of agriculture, both not only in your own career business, but also in the way policy is formed. So we are going to go ahead and sign off for today. I'm sorry, Stephanie, that we lost you due to connectivity issues, but we will be back next week. I don't want to tease next week because it's not official yet, but we have a pretty exciting opportunity that I'm hoping I can get confirmed sometime before the weekend and announce. So stay tuned for that. But thank you for tuning in to AgGrad Live. Make sure you're also subscribed on YouTube and that podcast that I plugged early in the show. Thanks. We'll be back next week.
Thank you for joining AgGrad Live. Visit aggrad.com, that's AGGRAD, to join the community, create your profile, and learn more about careers in the agriculture industry.